My life consisted of exploring underground caves and crevices. I lived an existence full of adrenaline and adventure, which completely distanced me from the monotony of everyday life. But what I saw and lost in that cave destroyed everything I had. That monster took everything from me. I should never have accepted that expedition, but you must know, those things were not of this world. It all began in October 1997. My name is Hans Weber, and I've been exploring the depths of the earth for over 30 years. Speleology has been my life, an escape and a refuge. I'm no stranger to danger. I've seen things down there that have made other men hang up their helmets forever. But when I received the call from Klaus Müller, something stirred in me. Klaus is a renowned geologist, and what he had found in the Hurlock Cave, in the Schwyz region, seemed to be the opportunity for one last great discovery before age forced me to retire. I knew the rumors. Colleagues spoke of that cave as if it were a death trap. Some never came out again. I wasn't a fool. I knew that accepting this invitation could be the last thing I did. But something in me pushed me to accept. The idea of exploring uncharted territory was irresistible, even for a man like me who has seen too much. What I didn't expect was my son's reaction, Stefan. He and I have never been close. He's ex-military, hardened by years of service, and never understood my passion for caves. When I told him about the expedition, he insisted on coming with me. He said the cave was too dangerous for me to face alone. Reluctantly, I agreed. I knew he was doing it to protect me, not out of love for adventure. We headed towards the cave, with Klaus leading the way. The alpine cold enveloped us as we walked. The air was charged with an ominous sense of stillness. After 6 hours of hiking, we finally reached the entrance of the Hurlock Cave. The landscape was desolate, a sea of rock and ice that seemed to stretch endlessly. Klaus, ever optimistic, suggested we camp right there to rest and prepare for the descent the next day. We were exhausted, but the excitement in his voice was palpable. For him, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an expedition that could change his career forever. For me, it was a mixture of anticipation and a growing sense that something wasn't right. With the camp set up, Stefan decided to explore the surroundings a bit. I watched him move away towards the mouth of the cave, his flashlight barely a spark in the darkness. He had always been like this. While I searched the earth for answers to ancient questions, Stefan preferred to face more tangible dangers. What I didn't expect was what he found. That night he returned a couple of hours later with the serious expression he always wore, but this time there was something different in his eyes, as if he had seen something that disturbed him. I asked if everything was all right, and he simply nodded, saying he hadn't found anything to worry about. Later, I would learn about the mutilated bats, cut in a way that didn't seem natural, but at that moment, Stefan decided not to alarm us, perhaps thinking there was already enough tension in the air. The next morning we prepared for the descent. The cave entrance was a dark crack in the rock, a hole that seemed to swallow light. We entered, first Klaus, then me, and finally Stefan, who brought up the rear. As we advanced, it was a maze, a tangle of narrow passages and dark chambers. Klaus, always the scientist, couldn't stop talking about the rock formations we found, pointing to mineral deposits that, according to him, were unique. I tried to focus on the walls and floor, looking for signs of danger, but something kept bothering me. The tunnels didn't seem natural. The walls weren't as irregular as one would expect in such a deep cave. There was something in the way they were arranged, as if someone or something had worked to mold them. Marks on the walls, cuts that seemed too precise to be made by a mere animal. I mentioned it quietly, but I didn't want to worry Klaus, who kept going without noticing the change in the environment. That night, as we camped in a small chamber, I felt an uneasiness I hadn't felt in years. The darkness was dense, almost palpable, and the sounds of the cave, those echoes and creaks that are usually common, seemed closer, more personal. Stefan didn't sleep much. I saw him with his hand near his weapon, his body tense. I tried to rest, but the noises wouldn't stop. It was as if something somewhere deeper in the cave was awake, watching us. The second night in the cave was unsettling, with a constant feeling that we weren't alone. I knew something wasn't right, and Stefan felt it too, but still the next day we pressed on, delving deeper into the belly of the earth, not knowing what awaited us in the depths. We went even further into the cave, leaving behind any trace of natural light. As we advanced, the structure of the tunnels became more complicated. Klaus checked his map and compass constantly, but even he was beginning to admit that we were in uncharted territories. The passages we discovered didn't appear on any map, and what initially seemed to be a well-traced route had become a labyrinth of uncertain paths. It was in one of those tunnels when we found it. The bodies were there, lying on the stone floor, as if they had suddenly dropped dead. But it wasn't death that disturbed me. It was the way they were preserved. Despite the humidity and the time that must have passed, the bodies were surprisingly intact, but mutilated in a way that sent a chill down my spine. The limbs, cut with a precision that no animal could achieve. The faces, frozen in expressions of terror. Stefan was the first to break the silence. His voice was tense when he said we should go back. I couldn't blame him. The scene was chilling even for someone like me, who had seen death up close on more than one occasion. But Klaus, with his growing obsession for discovery, insisted on continuing. For him, these bodies were a sign that we were about to find something big, something no one else had seen. Stefan wasn't convinced. He took me aside, away from Klaus, and warned me that all of this was very wrong. He said that if something happened, he would make sure I was safe, no matter what happened to Klaus. I didn't like the tone in his voice, that tone of contained desperation. I knew he was worried about me, but I also knew he was on the verge of losing patience. We continued, but now it was Stefan who led the group, insisting on going in front. He had become even more vigilant, his hand always near his weapon. As we advanced, the formations on the walls began to change. They were no longer simple mineral deposits, but something more organic. The slabs seemed to pulse with life of their own, and more than once I thought I saw movement at the edges of my vision, something that disappeared when I turned to look at it head-on. And then came the whispers, at first barely perceptible like the hum of wind in the cracks, but soon they became clearer, though unintelligible. It wasn't German or any language I had heard before. They were multiple voices speaking in unison, in a language that didn't belong to this world. Stefan, visibly disturbed, pulled out his weapon, saying he wouldn't let his guard down from that moment on. Finally, we reached a chamber illuminated by a natural water source. The place glowed with a dim, almost magical light that came from the water itself, as if it was impregnated with some kind of fluorescent material. While Klaus and I observed the source in amazement, Stefan stopped us, insisting that we stay at the entrance while he inspected the area. First, I saw him disappear into the darkness for a moment that felt eternal to me. When he returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. In his hands he carried a kind of carapace, a hard, segmented structure that seemed to have been left behind by a creature. It was huge, almost the size of a man, and had a texture unlike anything I had seen before. It looked as if the creature had shed its skin, something Stefan compared to cicadas. "We have to leave," he said, his voice sharp. "Whatever left this behind is further ahead. We're not prepared to face it." But Klaus, in his stubbornness, refused. He was determined to continue, to see with his own eyes what was about to be discovered. Stefan didn't want to hear reasons. but he knew his priority was to protect me. He suggested we take another path, one that wasn't the course of the water. I don't know if it was his tone of voice or the fear in his eyes, but we agreed. We changed route, moving away from the bright source, although I couldn't get out of my head that somehow we were being led towards what was waiting for us, and whatever was up ahead knew we were approaching. We went deeper into the cave. Each step was heavier than the last. The air became dense, and the darkness, despite our flashlights, seemed to have a life of its own, enveloping you. I was alert, much more than usual. I noticed him tense, his movements more cautious, walking ahead of us, his eyes scrutinizing every shadow, every corner. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. I saw him raise a hand, asking us for silence. At first, I didn't understand what had alarmed him, but then, in the absolute silence of the cave, I heard it too. Soft noises, as if something small and light was moving around us. They were footsteps, but I couldn't see anything. My eyes tried to penetrate the darkness, but there was nothing visible beyond the reach of our flashlights. The sound grew louder, as if whatever was causing it was getting closer. Suddenly, a loud thump resonated behind us. We turned quickly, and there, at the edge of the beam of our flashlights, was the creature. I don't know how to describe it justly. Its skin was a dark grey, almost black, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had 6 legs, each ending in sharp claws at least 6 inches long. What disturbed me the most was its huge mouth, full of teeth that seemed to move as if they were constantly grinding something. It didn't seem to have visible eyes, but it was clearly looking at us, as if it could see us in some other way. It emitted a sound that wasn't exactly a roar, but a constant low murmur, like a muffled growl that made my skin crawl. Stefan didn't hesitate for a second. "Back!" he shouted, as he pushed Klaus and me backwards. He pulled out his gun and a machete he carried in his backpack. The first shot echoed in the cave, the echo prolonging in the tunnels. The bullet hit the creature's head, and it let out a sharp screech, staggering, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at Stefan, its legs scratching the stone floor as it launched itself at him with a speed I didn't expect. Stefan fired again at the head, without missing. The creature staggered, its movements became clumsy, and before it could recover, Stefan dealt it a precise blow. With the machete at the base of the neck, the creature's head came off, and it finally fell to the ground, motionless. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. We thought it was all over, but from the top of the cave, another of the creatures appeared. Without hesitation, it lunged at Klaus. It was so fast I barely had time to react. The creature grabbed him with its claws, and in a brutal movement, dug them into his chest. Klaus didn't have time to scream. He just let out a choked groan before the creature dragged him towards a tunnel high up in the cave. I didn't scream, but it was too late. Klaus had disappeared into the darkness. Stefan, clearly upset, grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here now, Dad," he said. The urgency in his voice left no time for argument. We knew our lives depended on every second. We headed towards the exit of the cave, but when we got there, 2 of those horrible creatures were waiting for us. They were standing in the middle of the path, emitting that low and chilling roar, as if they were challenging us to approach. Stefan, already knowing what was going to happen, gripped the gun and machete he carried tightly. "I'm not afraid of them," he said aloud, more to himself than to me. "I'm going to kill them all without hesitation." The first creature lunged directly at Stefan. He was faster, shooting at the creature's head. The shot stunned it, causing its speed to decrease, but didn't stop it. Taking advantage of the moment, Stefan ran towards it, raising the machete and dealing a devastating blow to the middle of its head. The creature fell to the ground, dead, but there was no time to celebrate. The second creature began to move sideways, dodging the shots Stefan was firing at discretion. Some bullets impacted its body, but it seemed to not affect it in the least. Just as Stefan finished emptying the magazine, the creature leaped at him with brutal force, trapping his arm with its mouth and scratching him with its sharp claws. Stefan screamed in pain but didn't give up. With all the strength he had left, he managed to plunge the machete into the creature's throat, twisting the blade until he was sure it was dead. The beast fell heavily on him, immobilizing his injured arm. I ran towards him and, without hesitation, helped remove the creature's corpse from on top of his body. But just at that moment, we heard that loud screech that the creatures emitted, a sound that resonated on the walls of the cave, louder and closer than before. Stefan, despite the evident pain, got up quickly, ready to keep fighting. Without wasting a second, I took a bandage from my backpack and began to wrap it around Stefan's injured arm. "You have to resist, son," I told him, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "I'm fine, Dad," he replied, though his voice trembled with pain. "Come on, we have to get out of here." We both left the cave and decided to go back the same way we had come in. It was the fastest way out, and we knew the path. But we knew those creatures could be waiting for us around any corner. We arrived again at the place where the strange spring of water was that still glowed with that unreal light. Stefan suddenly stopped and took an explosive that looked like dynamite from his backpack. "Why did you bring that?" I asked, terrified. "In case there was a cave-in and we got trapped," he replied as he prepared the explosive. "But now I'll use it to trap those creatures down here." We advanced a bit more until we no longer heard the creatures behind us. Stefan proceeded to place the explosive at the entrance of one of the tunnels, carefully preparing the detonator. Just as he was finishing, in a moment of carelessness, one of the creatures lunged at me from the darkness, digging its sharp claws into my left shoulder and biting my arm with a force that made me scream in pain. Stefan, without hesitation, shot at the creature, hitting its head with a bullet that made it retreat. Despite his wound, Stefan ran towards me, helped me to my feet, and handed me the detonator. "Dad, you have to get out of here now. Count to 20 and detonate the charge. Don't worry about me, just go." The pain and fear clouded my mind, but I knew there was no other choice. I nodded with difficulty, starting to move away, but just as I was about to leave, I watched in horror as another creature jumped on Stefan from behind, knocking him to the ground and digging its claws into his body. "Dead!" was the last thing he shouted before the creature's roar drowned out his words. With a broken heart and tears blurring my vision, I pressed the button. The explosion resonated in the cave, closing the tunnel and burying my son along with the creature under tons of debris. I had lost him, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out and make sure his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. I left the cave staggering. Each step I took was a reminder of the pain in my arm and the loss of Stefan. I knew there was nothing more I could do for him, but the weight of what had just happened crushed me. The cave, now sealed by the cave-in, concealed the horrors we had found inside. No one would ever know the truth, and part of me wondered if that was for the best. I walked for what seemed like hours, getting weaker and weaker, closer and closer to falling. The blood I was losing from my injured arm soaked my clothes, and I felt life abandoning me little by little. Then, in the distance, I saw a group of figures moving. They were campers, a small group that had come to explore the area. They tried to talk to me, to help me, but my senses abandoned me. The last thing I remember is that one of them took me by the shoulders, and then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital with the distant sound of a heart monitor and the smell of disinfectant filling my senses. I was in a bed, covered in bandages, with a dull pain throughout my body. A nurse entered the room and looked at me with concern. "Mr. Weber," she said softly, "you were unconscious for more than 24 hours. You lost a lot of blood, but you're stable. Now there's an investigator who wants to talk to you about what happened in the cave. Do you feel strong enough for that?" I nodded slowly, although every movement reminded me how fragile I was. I knew I would have to face what had happened, but I didn't know how to explain what had really occurred. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. The investigator entered. Shortly after, a man with a stern face and a notebook in his hand sat next to my bed, looking at me with those eyes that seemed to want to unearth the truth. "Mr. Weber," he began, "we know you entered the cave with Dr. Müller and your son Stefan. I'd like you to tell me what happened down there, what occurred with Dr. Müller and your son." The words got caught in my throat. The images of Stefan injured, asking me to detonate the explosive, overwhelmed me. The creatures, the ship, all of that was too much for anyone to believe. So, with a lump in my throat and tears beginning to spring from my eyes, I told him the only story they could accept. "It was a cave-in," I said, my voice breaking. "We were exploring a new section, and suddenly the walls began to give way. Dr. Müller and Stefan, they didn't make it. Thanks to my son, I was able to survive. He saved my life." The investigator wrote something in his notebook, nodding slowly. I knew there was no way to verify what had really happened down there, and in part, I felt relieved that he didn't try. After the investigator left, I was left alone in the room, staring at the ceiling. I knew I would never be the same. The truth of what had occurred in Hurlock Cave would die with me, but the price I paid for that secret was too high. I had lost my son, and with him, any possibility of redemption. That day, my life changed forever. Although I might recover physically, the wound in my soul would never heal. Every night in my dreams I returned to the cave. I heard those whispers and saw Stefan asking me to save him, but it was already too late.